They cast me into the freezing snow with exactly $647 on the anniversary of my mother's death. But 12 years later, when my shameless stepmother crawled back demanding a room in my mansion, she did not realize that I had prepared a brutal, humiliating trap to strip her of everything. The first thing I remember about that night was the sound of the wind. It was not a whistle or a moan. It was a high-pitched, jagged shriek that tore through the valley of Oak Haven, carrying the first heavy snow of the season. The cold was not just a temperature. It was a physical weight that pressed against my chest, making every breath feel like I was inhaling crushed glass. I stood in the foyer of the house that should have been my sanctuary, but instead it felt like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. It was October the 14th. To anyone else, it was just a Tuesday. To me, it was the 12-year anniversary of the day my mother passed away. I had spent the morning at her grave, clearing the frost from her headstone, never imagining that by evening I would be fighting to keep the very roof she had helped build. Vivian stood at the top of the stairs, her silhouette framed by the warm, amber glow of the chandelier. The scent of her perfume arrived before she did a sharp, cloying, floral smell that was far too expensive for someone who had never worked a day in her life. It was a suffocating aroma that always seemed to mask something rotten underneath. She did not look at me with anger. She looked at me with a terrifying, calculated indifference. "The locks are being changed tomorrow morning, Wyatt," she said. Her voice was as smooth as silk and as cold as ice. "We have lived in this state of tension for far too long. This house needs a new energy, and quite frankly, you do not fit the blueprint anymore." I turned my gaze toward my father, Frank. He was standing near the fireplace, his shadow dancing long and distorted against the wall. He would not meet my eyes. He was busy adjusting a small porcelain figurine on the mantel, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. He was a man who had built a career on making tough decisions, yet here he was, unable to look at his own son while his wife dismantled our family. "Dad," I whispered. The word felt heavy like a stone in my mouth. "Are you really going to let this happen today, of all days?" Frank finally looked up, but his eyes were hollow. There was no fire in him, only a weary, desperate need for silence. "Vivian is right about the atmosphere, Wyatt. Perhaps some time apart will help us all. You are a grown man. It is time you found your own path." The betrayal was a sharp physical pain in my gut. I did not beg. I did not shout. I realized in that moment that I was not losing a home. I was being excised like a tumor from a body that no longer wanted to heal. I went to my room and grabbed the 2 suitcases I had packed in a daze. In the back of my closet, tucked inside an old ceramic jar shaped like an owl, was my entire life's savings. I poured the contents onto my bed. It was not much. I counted it, twice my fingers numb. Exactly $647. In a country where a single month of rent could cost twice that amount, $647 was not a fortune. It was a countdown to the end. I stuffed the crumpled bills into my inner jacket pocket, feeling the thinness of the paper against my ribs. As I reached the front door, Vivian stepped forward. She was holding a large black industrial trash bag. Without a word, she shoved it into my arms. It was heavy and awkward. "Do not leave your garbage behind," she sneered. I stepped out onto the porch. The transition from the heated house to the freezing night was a shock that made my heart stutter. The snow was already an inch deep on the wooden planks. I began to walk down the stairs, struggling with the suitcases and the heavy bag. Halfway down the driveway, the plastic of the trash bag caught on a jagged piece of the stone wall. I heard a loud, sickening rip. In an instant, the contents spilled out onto the white, frozen ground. It was not garbage. It was my mother's old journals, her sketches, and a collection of framed photographs that Vivian must have stripped from the walls of my room. I gasped, dropping to my knees in the snow. I tried to gather them, but the wind was faster. A photograph of my mother, laughing at the beach, slid across the ice, the glass shattering against a rock. The ink on a page of her diary began to bleed as the snow melted against the paper, turning her beautiful cursive into blue, illegible bruises. I looked back at the house. The porch light was still on, casting a mocking yellow square onto the driveway. I could see the two of them through the window. Frank was sitting in his armchair, and Vivian was pouring herself a glass of wine. They looked like a picture of perfect domestic peace. I stayed there on the ground for a long time, my hands turning a deep, angry red as I clawed at the snow to save what was left of my mother's memory. The $647 in my pocket felt like a curse. I was 22 years old, I was alone, and the only people who were supposed to love me were watching me freeze from behind a pane of glass. I stood up, cinched the broken bag with a piece of twine from my pocket, and turned my back on Oak Haven. I began the long walk toward the highway, the sound of my own footsteps in the snow the only company I had. I told myself that the cold would not kill me. I told myself that one day I would look back at this night, and I would not feel the sting of the wind or the ache of the betrayal. I would only feel the strength of the man who survived it. I walked until the lights of the town faded, heading toward the neon blue flicker of the Rusty Anchor Motel, clutching my $647 like a shield. The world was vast and indifferent, but I was still breathing. And that was enough to start a war. The Rusty Anchor Motel was a place where dreams went to die, or at the very least where they were forgotten in the haze of cheap tobacco and the hum of faulty wiring. For $85 a night, I occupied a room that smelled of lemon-scented ammonia and decades of accumulated despair. My $647 felt like a handful of sand leaking through my fingers. Every morning, I woke up to the realization that I was paying for the privilege of not freezing to death, and every evening the tally in my inner pocket grew lighter. Survival in those early weeks was not about inspiration, it was about observation. While most people saw a dumpster behind the local diner as a graveyard for waste, I saw it as a source of raw material. On a Tuesday morning, I found it a discarded armchair, its legs splintered and its fabric shredded by stray cats. Most would have seen firewood. I saw the ghost of a mid-century masterpiece, likely a genuine walnut frame, hidden under 3 layers of hideous, cracked latex paint. I hauled that chair back to the small concrete patch outside my motel room. I did not have a workshop or professional power tools. I had a set of hand scrapers, a pack of varying grit sandpaper, and a determination that bordered on obsession. The expertise I had gathered over the years from watching my mother work began to flow through my fingertips. I spent 4 days simply stripping the paint. I did not use harsh chemicals that would damage the integrity of the fibers. Instead, I used a steady hand and a sharp blade peeling away the white, then the green, then the brown, until the soul of the wood was revealed. It was indeed black walnut. The grain was tight and swirled in a cathedral pattern that indicated it had been harvested from a slow-growing tree. I learned the language of the wood again. I felt the difference between the sapwood and the heartwood. I spent hours hand-sanding, moving from 80 grit to 400 grit until the surface felt as smooth as polished bone. I did not use a modern spray-on finish. I chose a traditional hand-rubbed oil finish, applying layer after layer of tung oil, allowing the wood to breathe and darken naturally. I learned how to repair a loose mortise and tenon joint by using thin veneers of matching wood rather than relying on globs of glue. This was the difference between a repair and a restoration. As I sat on the curb buffing the final coat of wax into the walnut arms, a woman stopped at the edge of the parking lot. She looked to be in her early 20s, wearing an oversized hoodie and carrying a laptop bag that looked like it cost more than my car. "Is that a genuine 1956 lounge chair?" she asked. Her voice was sharp and filled with a curious energy. I looked up, squinting against the late afternoon sun. "It was a piece of trash 3 days ago. Now it is walnut and history." She stepped closer, running a finger over the smooth curve of the backrest. "You have a talent for grain matching. My name is Skylar Reed. I am a freelance digital strategist, but my hobby is hunting for mid-century gems. You were going to take this to the Oak Haven flea market, were you not?" "That was the plan," I admitted. "I need to cover my next week at the Rusty Anchor." Skylar shook her head, a small knowing smile on her lips. "If you take that to the flea market, a picker will give you $50 for it and sell it in the city for $1,000. You are selling a story, not just a chair. You need to be on the high-end auction blocks, not under a tent in a parking lot." She sat down on the low wall beside me and opened her laptop. Within 20 minutes, she had shown me a world I did not know existed. She talked about digital provenance, high-resolution macro photography, and curated online auction houses like one Dibs in Sotheby's home. "You provide the craftsmanship and the physical labor," Skylar said, her eyes reflecting the blue light of her screen. "I provide the digital reach and the high-ticket buyers. We list this as a curated restoration. We tell them about the $85 a night motel and the black walnut found in the dark. We sell the struggle as much as the furniture." That was the birth of Stone and Soul. It was no longer just a desperate attempt to stay afloat. It became a partnership of bone-deep expertise and modern strategy. We took photos of the chair against the gritty peeling brick wall of the motel, the contrast between the luxury of the wood and the poverty of the setting, creating a visual narrative that was irresistible. 6 days later, that chair which I had pulled from a pile of rotting cabbage and coffee grounds sold to an interior designer in New York City for $2,400. After shipping costs and Skylar's commission, I held more money in my hand than I had ever possessed in my life. I did not move out of the rusty anchor immediately. I stayed for another month, but I no longer felt like a ghost. I spent my days hunting for the broken, the discarded, and the forgotten. I worked until my hands bled and my eyes ached, but the countdown had stopped. The $647 was a memory. The war had officially begun, and for the first time since the night I was cast out, I realized that I had the weapons to win it. By the spring of 2024, Stone and Soul had moved from the concrete patch of a motel to a sprawling industrial warehouse, and finally to the crowning achievement of my career, the purchase of Summit Manor. The mansion sat like a silent sentinel atop the highest peak of Oakhaven, its stone facade weathered by a century of storms. When I signed the closing documents, the world saw a self-made millionaire buying a trophy. They did not know that every time I walked the hallowed halls of that estate, my skin prickled with a strange, haunting sense of déjà vu. I spent my first nights in the manor, not in the master suite, but in the grand library surrounded by the smell of aged leather and floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves. It was here that I placed the centerpiece of my personal collection, a tall, majestic long-case clock that I had spent months meticulously restoring. It was the same clock that had once stood in my childhood home before Vivian sold it off to a local picker. Finding it in a dusty basement in Vermont felt like a miracle. Fixing it felt like a duty. On a rainy Thursday evening, as the wind rattled the heavy casement windows, I opened the clock's waist door to adjust the pendulum. My fingers brushed against a slight irregularity in the back panel, a seam in the wood that did not align with the original joinery. I took a thin palette knife and gently pried at the edge. A small hidden compartment clicked open, and a single yellowed piece of paper fluttered to the floor. It was the missing page from my mother's journal. The jagged edge was unmistakable. As I smoothed it out on the library table, my breath hitched. The handwriting was frantic, the ink blotted in places as if she had been crying while she wrote. "I cannot keep this secret any longer," the page began. "Frank does not realize what he has done. He thinks he is protecting us by selling my father's estate to Vivian's investors for a fraction of its value. He does not see that Vivian orchestrated the entire debt. She convinced him that the manor was a liability, a drain on our future. She did not just sell a house. She sold my father's legacy, the very ground Wyatt was meant to inherit. Summit Manor belonged to the Thorne family for 3 generations. It was meant to be Wyatt's anchor. Now she has turned it into her personal bank account. If anything happens to me, I have hidden the proof of the fraudulent sale in the safe behind the library hearth. The code is hidden within the heartbeat of the home, the world tilted on its axis. I was not just a successful entrepreneur who had happened to buy a beautiful house. I was the rightful heir standing on the bones of a stolen empire. Vivian had not just pushed me out of a suburban home, she had systematically dismantled my family's history while I was a child, gaslighting my father into believing he was a failure so she could strip him of his assets. I turned back to the clock, my heart hammering against my ribs. "The heartbeat of the home," my mother had written. I looked at the brass dial of the clock. It was an intricate piece of machinery featuring a moon phase dial and a secondary hand for the seconds. I began to examine the internal gears I had polished so carefully. As I rotated the minute hand past the 12, I noticed something I had missed during the restoration. On the strike train wheel, 3 numbers had been delicately etched into the brass teeth numbers that were only visible when the clock was set to a very specific time. I moved the hands to those positions, 3, 9, and 7. A muffled mechanical click echoed from the depths of the clock's base. A small drawer at the very bottom slid forward, revealing a heavy tarnished iron key and a slip of paper with a sequence of movements for a dial. I crossed the room to the massive stone fireplace. I had noticed a slight gap in the masonry weeks ago, but assumed it was merely age. I inserted the iron key into a small hole disguised as a decorative knot in the woodwork and followed the sequence from the paper. With a heavy grinding sound, a section of the hearth slid back to reveal a steel wall safe. Inside were the original deeds to Summit Manor, bearing my grandfather's signature, and a series of private contracts between Vivian and a shell company she controlled. The documents proved that she had used forged power of attorney to sell the estate to herself for a single dollar before flipping it to the market. I sat on the cold floor, the evidence of a decade-long crime spread out before me. My success was no longer just about furniture or money. It was about a restoration of a much grander scale. I had bought back my own birthright with the money I earned from the skills my mother gave me. The clock in the corner struck midnight, its deep resonant chime filling the library. It sounded different now. It did not just mark the passage of time, it sounded like a bell of justice. I looked out the window at the distant flickering lights of the valley where Frank and Vivian lived in their comfortable, lied-to existence. They thought they had buried the truth under layers of debt and distance. They did not realize that a stone always remembers, and a soul never forgets its home. The reclamation had begun. The morning sun hit the marble floors of Summit Manor with a blinding intensity. I stood in the grand foyer watching the heavy iron gates at the end of the driveway slowly swing open. A dusty sedan, one I recognized from a lifetime ago, crawled up the path. When it stopped, the doors opened, and the ghosts of my past stepped out into the light. Vivian led the way, her chin tilted high, her eyes scanning the limestone columns and the sprawling lawn with a hunger that she did not even try to hide. Frank followed behind her, looking smaller and more fragile than I remembered, his shoulders hunched as if he expected a blow. Behind them came Sam and Chloe. Sam, now a young man in his late teens, kept his head down while Chloe looked around with wide, uncertain eyes. They entered the foyer, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the high ceilings. Vivian did not wait for an invitation. She walked to the center of the room and inhaled deeply, that sharp, cloying perfume of hers filling the air. "You have done well for yourself, Wyatt," she said, her voice dripping with a false honeyed affection. "We saw the article in the Gazette. It is only right that we are here. After all, a house this large is far too lonely for one person. It is time we brought the family back together. We will start moving our things in this weekend." I leaned against the mahogany banister, watching her. "You think you can just walk in here after 12 years of silence?" "Family is family, Wyatt," she replied, her eyes narrowing. "You owe your father for raising you, and you owe me for keeping this family intact when everything was falling apart. It is a matter of duty. You have all this extra room, and we are struggling in that small house in the valley. It is only fair." I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Duty? That is a fascinating word coming from you, Vivian." I reached into the folder I was holding and pulled out a photocopy of the original deed to Summit Manor. I watched the color drain from her face as she recognized the document. "I know how you got the house the first time, Vivian," I said, my voice low and steady. I know about the shell company. I know about the forged power of attorney. I know you stole this from my mother and my grandfather." Vivian let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "That is ancient history, Wyatt. Those papers mean nothing now. You bought the house back fairly. You cannot prove a crime from 20 years ago. We are moving in, and if you try to stop us, I will tell the press that the great Wyatt Stone is a heartless man who lets his elderly father live in poverty." "She is right, Wyatt." Frank whispered, his voice cracking. "We have nowhere else to go, please." "He did not send those papers to you, Vivian." A new voice interrupted. We all turned. Sam had stepped forward, his face pale but his gaze unwavering. He was not looking at me, he was looking directly at Vivian. "I sent them," Sam said. The silence that followed was so thick I could hear the ticking of the long case clock in the library. Vivian stared at her son as if he were a stranger. "What did you say?" she hissed. "I found the diary page in the attic 3 years ago." Sam continued, his voice growing stronger. "I am the one who mailed it to Wyatt. I am the one who sent the bank records and the legal filings. I have been watching you, Mom. I saw the way you handled the education funds that Grandpa left for me and Wyatt. You did not spend them on my tuition. You moved them into an offshore account in your maiden name. I have the digital trail. I have everything." The revelation landed with the force of a landslide. Vivian stumbled back, her hand clutching her throat. The image of the perfect, controlling mother shattered in an instant. Sam reached into his backpack and pulled out a tablet displaying a series of transaction logs that were undeniable. "You stole from your own children," I said, stepping toward her. "You dismantled my life, and then you tried to do the same to Sam." Frank looked between his wife and his son, his mouth hanging open. "Vivian, is this true?" "The money for Sam's college. You said it was lost in the market." She did not answer. She looked like a trapped animal, her eyes darting toward the door. I pulled a legal document from my folder and laid it on the marble table between us. It was a contract I had prepared with the help of my legal team. "Here is the deal, Frank," I said, looking my father in the eye. "You have 2 choices. Choice 1, I call the authorities right now. Sam and I provide all the evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. You and Vivian will both go to prison for a very long time. Choice 2, you sign this document. It is an immediate filing for divorce and an affidavit stating that Vivian has no claim to any family assets. You will escort her off this property right now, and she will never contact any of us again. In exchange, I will not press charges, and I will provide you with a modest cottage and a pension for the rest of your life. But you must excise the poison from this family today." The tension in the room was electric. Vivian began to scream a high panicked sound, but Frank was no longer listening. He looked at the evidence on Sam's tablet, then at the house he had lost, and finally at the son he had betrayed. He picked up the pen. "Frank, do not you dare!" Vivian shrieked. He did not look at her. With a shaking hand, he signed his name across the bottom of the contract. The war was over, and the verdict was final. The restoration of the Thorne family had begun with the stroke of a pen. The silence that followed the scratching of Frank's pen on the legal document was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a decade of lies collapsing under their own weight. Vivian stood frozen, her face a mask of distorted fury and disbelief. For the first time in her life, the world she had carefully manufactured through manipulation and theft had ceased to exist. "You have 10 minutes, I said, my voice quiet but echoing with an authority that left no room for negotiation. "Take whatever you brought with you in that car. Nothing else in this house belongs to you. Not a single silver spoon, not a single memory." I watched from the grand balcony as Vivian was escorted to the driveway. There were no suitcases this time. There were no boxes of memories. She carried nothing but her handbag and the weight of her own greed. As she stepped out into the crisp morning air of Iron Peak, she looked small against the vastness of the estate. She was exactly where I had been 12 years ago, standing in the shadow of a home that no longer belonged to her, with the world stretched out before her and no one to call for help. The cycle of the $647 had finally come to its bitter conclusion for the woman who started it. Frank remained in the foyer, his head bowed. He did not ask for a room in the manor. I think he knew that the distance between us could not be bridged by a hallway. A few days later, I moved him into a small stone cottage at the very base of the hill near the edge of the woods. It was a simple place with a view of the path leading up to Summit Manor. It was close enough for me to ensure he was fed and cared for, but far enough to remind him of the height from which he had fallen. He spent his days tending to a small garden and looking up at the peak, a man living in the quiet, heavy atmosphere of his own repentance. With the legal battles settled and the past finally reckoned with, I turned my focus toward the future of Stone and Soul. I realized that my craft had never really been about wood or varnish. It had been about seeing value where others saw waste. It was about the belief that something broken could be made whole again if someone was willing to put in the work. I used a portion of the profits from the restoration of Summit Manor to establish the Second Chance Foundation. We did not just offer money, we offered mentorship. We sought out young people who had been cast out of their homes, children who had been told that they were nothing more than a liability. We built a vocational school in Oak Haven where they could learn the art of restoration, the science of business, and the discipline of self-worth. I wanted them to know that their beginning did not have to dictate their end. I wanted them to see that even a splintered life could be finished with grace and strength. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and deep gold, I walked out onto the main balcony of the manor. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth from the valley below. I looked down at the flickering lights of Oak Haven. I could see the neon blue sign of the Rusty Anchor Motel, a tiny dot of light in the distance. I remembered the boy who had knelt in the snow crying over shattered photographs and bleeding ink. I remembered the man who had sanded Walnut Arms until his fingers were raw, but the anger that had fueled those memories was gone. In its place was a profound, quiet peace. I realized that the greatest restoration I had ever performed was not on a chair or a clock or even a mansion. It was on myself. I had taken the broken pieces of a discarded life, and with patience and grit, I had built something that could withstand the storms. I was no longer a victim of my father's silence or my stepmother's cruelty. I was Wyatt Stone, the keeper of my own legacy and the guardian of my family's soul. The light on Iron Peak did not just signify my success. It was a lighthouse for anyone who felt they were currently standing in the dark, clutching their own version of a $647 curse. The truth was finally out, the work was finished, and for the first time in 12 years, I was home. My journey has never truly been about the money or the marble floors. It has been about the long, difficult process of reclaiming the value that others tried to strip away from me. It has been about finding my own worth in a world that told me I was disposable. Have you ever been underestimated or cast aside by the people who were supposed to support you? How did you find the strength to stand back up? Please share your story with me in the comments. Your resilience matters, and I want to hear how you turned your own broken pieces into something beautiful.